clean this up. That's what you're here for.
She didn't move. Not because she was afraid. Because she'd already seen this exact moment happen before.
By the time the phones came out, everyone in that hallway already knew something was about to go too far.
I don't work housekeeping.
Then what exactly are you doing standing in my hallway?
Dr. Bradley Kessler's voice carried down the surgical wing hallway, sharp enough to stop 3 residents mid-stride. A tray of instruments lay scattered across the tile at his feet, his own tray, knocked from a passing cart when he'd turned too fast, too impatient, mid-complaint about a delayed or turnover. He wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at the woman standing nearest to it. Dr. Camille Yates didn't move. She stood in a plain gray cardigan, flat shoes, a visitor badge clipped to her collar with nothing on it but a first name and a photo. A worn notebook rested in the crook of her arm. To Kessler, glancing past her toward the elevator bank, she looked exactly like what he needed her to be in that moment, someone beneath his notice, conveniently available to fix a problem he'd caused. If you think you already know who's about to apologize in this story, stay with me, because the woman he's talking to is about to become the reason his entire career changes shape, and you haven't seen where this goes yet. Comment the city and the time you're watching this from, then subscribe, because it gets a lot heavier from here. Did you hear me? Kessler said, louder now, playing to the small crowd gathering the way he always did without seeming to notice he was doing it. A donor tour group had paused near the nurse's station, phones lowered, watching. I don't have time to wait for housekeeping to notice a mess in my own hallway. I don't work housekeeping, Camille said. Calm. Even. Kessler's eyebrows rose, delighted by the opening. Then what exactly are you doing standing in my hallway in a cardigan looking like you got lost on your way to a church bake sale? A few residents laughed, quiet and uncertain, the kind of laughter that comes from not knowing whether it's safe not to. I'm observing, Camille said. Observing. Kessler repeated the word like it amused him. You don't even know what floor housekeeping reports to, do you? Sweetheart, this is a level 1 trauma surgical program. We don't have room today for whoever wandered in off the street. Camille opened her notebook. Wrote 3 words. Closed it again. That, more than anything he'd said, seemed to unsettle him, though he covered it with another laugh, turning back toward his residence like the moment was already over, already forgotten, already exactly the kind of thing that never followed men like him anywhere. It was 9:14 in the morning. Camille had been inside St. Adeline Regional Medical Center for exactly 19 minutes. 18 hours earlier, in a state office 3 counties away, Deputy Inspector Owen Marsh had argued gently against the plan one more time. They'll roll out the welcome mat if we announce it, Camille said, signing the last authorization form on her desk without looking up. I want to see what a hallway looks like when nobody's performing for anyone important. You'll be walking in with no visible authority at all. That's the point, Owen. St. Adeline had been flagged for review after a cluster of unusual patient complaint patterns buried in routine paperwork, nothing dramatic on paper, nothing that would draw headlines, just enough small inconsistencies that a careful reader learned to recognize as smoke. Camille had read enough of those quiet files over 11 years to know smoke rarely showed up alone. She arrived that morning in her own car, showed a standard visitor badge at the front desk, and walked the surgical wing corridors for 19 minutes before anyone said a single word to her. She'd watched a nursing assistant get waved off mid-sentence by a passing attending. She'd watched 2 residents avoid eye contact with a support staff member cleaning a supply closet, stepping around her like she was furniture. She'd watched a man in expensive shoes knock over his own instrument tray and immediately look for someone smaller to blame for it. She hadn't expected him to choose her. It didn't matter. She'd have watched the same thing happen to anyone standing in that spot. What she hadn't expected, not yet, not this early into the visit, was Imani Duval, a young nursing assistant 3 feet away with a supply cart, watching the whole exchange with white-knuckled hands and an expression Camille recognized instantly, because she'd seen it on 100 faces in 100 hallways over 11 years of doing this work. It was the specific, quiet expression of someone who had absorbed exactly this kind of moment before, more than once, and had learned there was no version of speaking up that ever seemed to change anything. Camille didn't know yet about the 2 complaints sitting in a folder in Imani's locker, both closed within 72 hours with no interviews conducted. She didn't know about CEO Jae-won Shin's private drive, 3 floors up, holding records that had never once made it into any system regulators were allowed to see. She only knew, standing in that hallway at 9:14 that morning, that Bradley Kessler had just made the same mistake 11 documented times before her, mistaking silence for weakness, and stillness for something to be finished off in front of an audience. He was about to learn, in front of that same audience, exactly how wrong that mistake had been. Kessler didn't walk away, not really. He circled back within 30 seconds, the way certain men do when a room hasn't finished admiring them yet. "You know what," he said, turning back to Camille with the easy, practiced charm of someone who'd never once been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered to him. "I actually don't think you're supposed to be up here at all. This is a restricted surgical corridor. Badges like yours," he flicked 2 fingers toward her collar without touching it, "those are usually building services. Front lobby, 2nd floor. Not here." "I have clearance for this floor," Camille said. "Says who?" "Says the paperwork your administration signed 11 days ago." For half a second, something flickered behind Kessler's eyes, not doubt exactly, more like a man noticing a word he didn't expect in a sentence he thought he already understood. He covered it fast, the way he covered everything, with volume. "Paperwork," he repeated, loud enough that the donor tour group, still lingering near the nurse's station under the polite pretense of admiring a wall plaque, turned fully toward them now. "Everybody's got paperwork these days. Doesn't mean you belong on a surgical floor during active case turnover. I'm aware of what's active on this floor." "Are you?" He smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "You know what I think? I think you wandered up here because somebody at the front desk felt sorry for you and didn't want to make a scene. I think if I call security right now and ask them who authorized a woman in a cardigan to stand in my hallway, they're going to have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about." Camille said nothing. "I'll give you a minute to walk yourself out," Kessler said, raising his voice further, performing now for an audience that had grown to nearly a dozen people, residents, 2 nurses who'd stopped mid-task, the donor group whose phones had quietly come back up. "After that, I call security, and trust me, they will not be gentle about escorting you off my floor." Somewhere near the supply cart, Imani Duval stood frozen, knuckles wide around the cart's handle, watching with an expression she'd worn before, 2 years ago, the first time a doctor had told her, in front of an entire nurse's station, that she was lucky anybody let her touch equipment this expensive. She'd said nothing that day either. She'd filed a complaint instead. It had taken her own hospital's compliance office 72 hours to close it. Insufficient evidence. She watched the woman in the cardigan now, and something in her chest tightened at how completely still she stood. Not frightened still. Not frozen still. Something else. Something Imani didn't have a word for yet. "I don't need a minute," Camille said finally, quiet enough that people leaned in to hear it. "I'm not going anywhere, Dr. Kessler." His jaw tightened at the sound of his own name in her mouth, a small thing, but it landed wrong, the way it always lands wrong when someone you've decided doesn't matter turns out to already know exactly who you are. "Fine," he said, voice thinning slightly, though he covered it by turning toward the nearest resident. "Get me security." Nobody moved right away. Something in the hallway had shifted, subtle but real, the air pressure of a room that senses a storm before it can name one. That was the exact moment the elevator chimed at the end of the corridor. The doors opened. A hospital board liaison stepped out, mid-50s, brisk pace, a leather folio tucked under one arm, and walked directly past Kessler without so much as a glance, straight toward the woman in the gray cardigan standing perfectly still near the supply cart. "Dr. Yates," the liaison said, extending a hand. "Apologies for the delay, the board wanted to confirm timing before I came up. We're ready whenever you are for the compliance briefing." the hallway went very quiet. Kessler's mouth was still open from the sentence he hadn't finished. "Dr. Yates," the liaison said again, when Camille didn't immediately respond, "should I have compliance meet us in the small conference room, or would you prefer the boardroom given the scope you mentioned on the call?" "Small conference room is fine," Camille said. "I'd rather start narrow." Kessler's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I'm sorry, Dr. Yates?" The liaison glanced at him, mildly surprised anyone needed clarification. "Dr. Camille Yates. Chief Medical Inspector, State Department of Health. She's leading today's unannounced compliance review." A beat, as the liaison's gaze took in the scattered instrument tray, the frozen hallway, the donor group's raised phones, the particular quality of silence that follows a public humiliation nobody's quite ready to name out loud yet. "I take it you two have already met." Nobody answered that. Camille turned, unhurried, and looked at Kessler directly for the first time since the tray had hit the floor. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With the same flat, careful attention she'd been giving the entire hallway for the last 19 minutes, the attention of someone who had simply been waiting for a room to finish showing her exactly what it actually was. "Dr. Kessler," she said. "Thank you for the demonstration." He didn't have an answer for that. For possibly the first time in his professional life, Bradley Kessler stood in a crowded hallway with absolutely nothing to say, and everyone present would remember, later, exactly how long that silence lasted. Camille opened her notebook one final time in front of him, wrote something brief, and closed it. "I'll need conference room access within the hour," she told the liaison. "And I'll need whoever handles this hospital's compliance and HR tracking systems available for the full afternoon." Not their assistant. Them, directly. "I'll call Mr. Shin's office now," the liaison said. Something in Kessler's expression shifted at the CEO's name, not fear yet, not quite, but the particular unease of a man doing math he didn't want to be doing. 3 floors up, in a corner office with a view of the hospital's new cardiac wing groundbreaking site, CEO Jae-won Shin was midway through a donor call when his assistant knocked twice and stepped in without waiting to be told to. "Mr. Shin. The state inspector is already on site." "I know. She's not due until 1. She's been here since 8:40. There was an incident in the surgical wing." "Dr. Kessler." His assistant hesitated. "It's already being talked about on 3 floors. Shin set down his phone slowly, the donor call still holding on the other line, forgotten. He'd spent 4 years building a very specific story about St. Adeline Regional, a story built around Kessler's name, Kessler's outcomes, Kessler's face on the capital campaign materials for a cardiac wing that hadn't broken ground yet but had already raised $11 million against his reputation alone. He'd spent those same 4 years making sure certain other stories about Kessler never made it past his own desk. He hadn't planned for both stories to collide in a public hallway on the exact morning a state inspector arrived early enough to see it happen with her own eyes. "Get me legal," Shin said quietly. "And find out exactly what she saw." His assistant hesitated in the doorway. "Sir, she's not just observing anymore. She's asked for the full compliance and HR tracking system. Today. Not a scheduled pull. Today." Shin looked past his assistant, out the window, toward the empty lot where a groundbreaking ceremony was scheduled in 6 weeks, ribbon already ordered, donor plaques already engraved with a surgeon's name he could no longer be entirely certain was going to survive the afternoon. "Today," he repeated, quiet, like the word itself had weight now it hadn't carried an hour ago. Down in the surgical wing, the hallway had mostly emptied, the donor group ushered gently but firmly toward the elevators by a nervous administrator. The residents dispersed back to their rounds with the specific, careful silence of people who'd just watched something they weren't sure yet how to talk about. Imani Duval remained by the supply cart a moment longer than she needed to, watching Camille disappear down the corridor toward the conference rooms, notebook still tucked beneath her arm. She thought about the folder in her locker. 2 complaints, both closed in 72 hours, both marked with the same 4 words she'd read so many times she could recite them without looking. Insufficient evidence of intent. For the first time in 2 years, she wondered if that folder might finally be worth more than the silence she'd been trading it for. The conference room filled quickly. Owen Marsh with a secure laptop, a compliance attorney named Priya Nair pulled in from the hospital's legal office, boxes of interview forms nobody had expected to need before lunch. Camille set 3 rules before the first interview began, the same 3 rules she'd opened within 11 other hospitals over 11 years, adjusted slightly each time by whatever that particular building had taught her. Every conversation is recorded, with the subject's knowledge, she said. No one is interviewed with a direct supervisor present. And we start with the newest hires and work up. They've got the least invested in protecting anyone, and the most to lose by speaking anyway. Marsh nodded, already pulling the first name from the shift roster. Newest hire on the surgical floor is a nursing assistant. Started 14 months ago. Not her yet, Camille said. Start with someone who wasn't in that hallway this morning. I don't want the first interview colored by what they just watched happen to me. They started instead with a first-year surgical resident, 26 years old, hands folded so tightly on the table that his knuckles had gone pale before Camille asked a single question. Relax, she told him. This isn't a deposition. I want to understand what an ordinary week looks like here. Everything's fine, he said immediately. Dr. Kessler's tough, but he's brilliant. Everybody wants to train under him. Is that why people don't report things? Silence. Let me ask differently, Camille said. When was the last time you saw someone treated unfairly on this floor, and nobody did anything about it? The resident looked at the recorder. Looked at Priya Nair. Looked back at Camille. This morning, he said quietly. In the hallway. But also, before today. That was the first crack. Camille had learned, over 11 years, that it was rarely the last. By early afternoon, they'd interviewed 6 people, a surgical tech, 2 residents, a unit clerk, a transport aide, a second-year fellow, and the shape of the pattern had begun assembling itself the way it always did, slowly, then all at once. A tech described being told she was lucky to be in the room during a complex case. A resident described being passed over for a rotation that went, without explanation, to someone less qualified but more personally favored. Each story different in its details. Each one landing in exactly the same place, a culture where complaints went in, and almost nothing ever came back out. 3 floors above, Bradley Kessler sat alone in the surgeon's lounge, still in his scrub cap, a cold cup of coffee untouched on the table in front of him. He hadn't gone back into an or since the hallway. He'd told the charge nurse he needed a minute. It had been closer to 2 hours. He kept replaying it. Not the tray. Not even the word observing, which he'd mocked without understanding why it had unsettled him at the time. It was her stillness he kept returning to, the way she hadn't flinched, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't done any of the things people were supposed to do when Bradley Kessler decided to make an example of them in front of an audience. He'd built a career on being the loudest, most certain person in every room he entered. It had never once failed him. It had failed him completely by 9:20 that morning, and he didn't yet understand why that unsettled him more than the actual consequences he hadn't even begun to imagine yet. Down in the enlisted adjacent world of hourly hospital staff, the break rooms, the supply closets, the locker bays nobody with a title ever bothered to visit, word had already traveled faster than any official memo could have moved it. Imani Duval sat on the edge of a bench in the staff locker room, a manila folder resting unopened on her lap, listening to her roommate-turned-coworker Denise talk fast and low about what everyone was already calling the hallway thing. She's a state inspector. A real one. Pulling files today, not next month. Today. I know, Imani said quietly. Did you see it happen? Imani didn't answer right away. She was thinking instead about the exact second Camille Yates had looked past Kessler, past the residents, past the entire watching hallway, and landed, just for a moment, directly on her. Not a glance. Not a passing look. Seen. She opened the folder in her lap, just enough to see the first line of her own complaint from 14 months ago, and closed it again before she'd decided anything at all. Imani stood outside the conference room door for almost 4 minutes before she made herself knock. Owen Marsh answered, glancing at the folder pressed against her chest. "Can I help you?" "I want to talk to the inspector," Imani said. "I have documentation." He led her in without another word. Camille looked up from a stack of interview notes, recognized her immediately, the nursing assistant by the supply cart, the one who'd watched the entire hallway scene without a single flicker of surprise, like she'd seen some version of it before. "Take your time," Camille said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Imani sat. She placed the folder on the table between them and didn't open it right away. "I filed 2 formal complaints in the past 14 months, she said finally, her voice steadier than her hands. "I kept copies of everything. Every form. Every response." "Go ahead." She opened the folder and laid the documents out one at a time, the way she'd rehearsed it in her head a dozen times without ever expecting to actually do it. "First one," Imani said. 6 months into working here. A senior attending told me, in front of 2 other nurses, that I was lucky anybody let me near equipment this expensive. I filed a complaint that same afternoon." She slid the response across the table. 4 words, printed flat and final. "Insufficient evidence of intent. No interview. No follow-up. Nothing." Camille read it slowly, the way she read every document like this, like a letter from a world she already knew existed but kept hoping she'd been wrong about. "Second complaint," Imani continued. 3 months ago. Dr. Kessler, in the supply corridor, told me I should be grateful anyone let me touch a scalpel tray. I filed that one too." Another response, slightly faster this time, 72 hours instead of 11 days. Same 4 words. "Case closed. No interview with him. No interview with the 2 people who witnessed it." "Did anyone from compliance contact you after either complaint?" "No, ma'am. Just the email." Case closed. "Did anyone ever interview Dr. Kessler about either incident?" "Not that I know of." Camille placed the documents carefully back inside the folder, the way someone handles something they intend to keep intact. "Ms. Duval, did you consider not bringing this forward today?" Imani nodded. "For about an hour, after I saw what happened this morning." "What changed your mind?" She looked down at her hands. They'd stopped shaking somewhere in the last 2 minutes, she realized. "You didn't move," Imani said quietly. "He said everything he could think of to make you small, in front of an entire hallway, and you just stood there. You didn't yell. You didn't cry. You didn't leave." She looked up. "I'd been leaving for 2 years. I figured maybe it was time to try standing instead." Camille held her gaze for a long moment, the kind of stillness that had unsettled Kessler that morning and now, in this room, felt entirely different, like something steady enough to actually lean against. "Ms. Duval," Camille said, turning to Priya, "enter these complaint records into the investigation file. Flag both for failure to follow standard complaint review procedure. Note that Ms. Duval came forward voluntarily, with no promise of any outcome." "Yes, ma'am." Camille looked back at Imani. "What you did in this room took more courage than most people in this building will ever understand." Imani stood, nodded, and made it exactly to the hallway before the tears came, not sad tears, the kind that arrive when something's been held so long you'd forgotten how heavy it actually was. Back in the conference room, Camille sat alone for a moment with the folder still open in front of her. 2 complaints. Both dismissed in days, not months. Both from a 26-year-old who'd kept every scrap of paper anyway, in a locker nobody with authority had ever bothered to check, because some stubborn part of her had refused to believe the system deserved her silence forever. Camille opened a clean page in her own notebook and wrote 2 words at the top. Pattern confirmed. Then she picked up her phone to call Marsh back in from the hallway. It was time to look at exactly who had been closing these complaints so quickly, and why? Kessler entered the conference room at 3:40 that afternoon, still in scrubs, no charm left in his posture at all. Camille didn't mention the hallway directly. She didn't need to. Dr. Kessler, are you aware of a complaint filed against you by Ms. Duval approximately 3 months ago? Vaguely. It was closed. Were you ever interviewed about it? No. Were you informed a complaint had been filed? I heard about it through the department. Through the department. Not through a formal notification process. He shifted in his seat. I don't recall a formal notification. Camille made a note without looking up. Let's discuss this morning. You approached a woman you believed to be a support staff member. Describe what happened. I asked her to clean up a spill. Is that all you did? Silence. There are multiple recordings from staff and visitor phones currently under review, Camille said. I'd encourage accuracy. Kessler's jaw worked. His eyes dropped to the table. I made comments about her appearance. Whether she belonged there. I threatened to have security remove her. You told her she got lost on her way to a bake sale. You implied she didn't understand basic hospital hierarchy. You told her you'd give her a minute before security wouldn't be gentle. Is that accurate? Each sentence landed like a weight settling onto his chest. Yes. Did any staff member present intervene? No. Did anyone from hospital administration intervene? Another pause, longer this time, something old fighting something newly urgent behind his eyes. No, he said finally. Mr. Shin's assistant was aware of the incident within minutes, according to what I've heard. Camille wrote that down without comment. Dr. Kessler, she said, I'm not here to end your career over a single hallway incident. I'm here because that incident revealed a climate that allowed it, and has apparently been allowing similar things for years. Do you understand the difference? He nodded slowly, the particular nod of a man who'd just been shown the difference between a crack in a wall and a crack running through the foundation underneath it. You're dismissed for now, Camille said. Remain on site and available. He stood, reached the door, and stopped when she spoke again. Dr. Kessler. Next time you decide someone doesn't matter enough to matter, consider that you might be wrong about that far more often than you think. He left without answering. He didn't have one. Owen Marsh found the discrepancy at 6:15 that evening, buried in metadata nobody had thought to check until the numbers stopped adding up. Ma'am. The hospital's official compliance tracking system shows 11 complaints against Dr. Kessler over 4 years. All closed. Average closure time, 79 hours. He turned his laptop toward Camille. But the HR department's internal audit log references 14 complaints. Not 11. Camille leaned in. Where are the other 3? That's the problem. They're not in any system I have access to yet. They found them 90 minutes later, after a records request pre-and-ner pushed through with visible discomfort, 3 complaint files stored not in the hospital's shared compliance server, but in a private administrative drive requiring executive-level credentials. CEO Jae-won Shin's credentials. The timestamps told their own story. All 3 complaints had been received into the system, then manually removed and refiled as administrative review, pending, a status that meant, functionally, nowhere. 2 of the 3 removals had occurred within the same 6-week window as the capital campaign's public launch, the one built around Kessler's name and reputation. He didn't just fail to act, Camille said quietly, reading the access logs herself now. He physically moved these out of anywhere a regulator would ever look. Marsh sat back. Timed around the campaign. Timed around $11 million in pledges attached to a surgeon's name, Camille said. A name that couldn't survive a documented harassment pattern becoming public before groundbreaking. She thought of Imani's folder, the 4 words repeated twice. Insufficient evidence of intent. She thought of Kessler in the conference room, genuinely startled to learn his own hospital had known about him for years and simply managed the paperwork instead of the man. This wasn't a story about one bad afternoon in a hallway anymore. It hadn't been that story since roughly 19 minutes into her visit, if she was honest with herself. Get me everything on Shin's calendar for the 6 weeks around each removal, Camille said. Donor meetings. Campaign planning. I want to know exactly what he was protecting, and exactly when he decided a surgeon's reputation was worth more than the people reporting on him. Marsh was already typing. And Kessler? Kessler's punishment fits Kessler's actions, Camille said. She tapped the private drive's access log once, hard enough to make the point without raising her voice. This is a different kind of failure. This is the kind that doesn't happen by accident, and doesn't happen just once. Outside the conference room window, the parking lot lights had come on. Somewhere 3 floors up, Jae-won Shin was still in his office, phone pressed to his ear, still telling legal this could be contained. He had no idea yet that containment had stopped being possible roughly the moment Owen Marsh noticed a difference between 11 and 14. Jae-won Shin's interview began at 8:05 that evening. It lasted 31 minutes. Camille placed 3 items on the table before she said a word: the private drive's access log, the 3 refiled complaints, and a printed calendar entry from 6 weeks earlier: Cardiac Wing Capital Campaign, Kessler Media Package Final Review. Mr. Shin. Your hospital's compliance system shows 11 complaints filed against Dr. Kessler over 4 years. Your internal HR audit references 14. Can you explain the discrepancy? I'd have to look into that. You don't need to look into it. You have executive-level access to the drive where the missing 3 were stored. All 3 moved out of the standard tracking system and marked administrative review, pending within days of 2 capital campaign milestones. Shin's composure held, but only barely. Those complaints were being handled carefully, given their sensitivity. Handled where regulators couldn't see them. That's not, Mr. Shin, I was standing in your hallway at 9:14 this morning. I watched your star surgeon publicly humiliate a woman he believed was powerless, in front of a donor tour your office had scheduled for that exact hour. I watched no one intervene. And I've since learned your hospital has known about a documented pattern of similar behavior for 4 years, and that you personally ensured 3 of those complaints never reached anyone with the authority to act on them. Shin's jaw tightened, the same particular tightness Kessler's had carried 3 hours earlier, though for an entirely different reason. The campaign was $11 million, he said finally, quieter now. Groundbreaking in 6 weeks. I made a judgment call. You made a business decision, Camille said. Using a system built to protect patients and staff as a filing cabinet for your own convenience. That's not a judgment call, Mr. Shin. That's concealment. I'm not the one who said those things to her in that hallway. No, Camille agreed. You're the one who made it possible for someone to say them for 4 years without consequence. She closed her notebook. This interview is concluded. You'll be informed of formal findings through appropriate channels. I'd recommend contacting counsel of your own, separate from hospital counsel, before that conversation happens. Shin stood slowly, legs not quite cooperating, and reached the door before he turned back. Was any of this ever really about the hallway? He asked. No, Camille said. The hallway just happened to be the first thing I saw with my own eyes. Everything after that was already there, waiting for someone to actually look. He left without another word. Camille sat alone afterward, the 3 refiled complaints spread in front of her, and wrote 2 words at the top of a clean page. Systemic concealment. Then she picked up her phone to call the state office. It was well past time. The report landed on the Secretary of Health's desk 9 days later. 31 pages, 8 appendices, 62 footnotes, the kind of document that ends quietly on paper and detonates loudly everywhere else. Camille had titled it Command Climate and Compliance Assessment, St. Adeline Regional Medical Center. Inside the state office, people had already started calling it something shorter, the Adeline Report. The findings were organized into 3 tiers, the same structure Camille used whenever a single incident turned out to be standing on top of something much larger. Tier 1, individual misconduct. Tier 2, institutional failure to respond. Tier 3, deliberate systemic concealment. Most reviews stopped at Tier 1. Some reached Tier 2. 3 tiers meant the rot ran all the way to the foundation, and Camille had learned, over 11 years, that foundations rarely fixed themselves once someone finally pointed a flashlight at them. The numbers, laid out plainly in Appendix C, did more work than any paragraph of narrative ever could. 14 documented complaints against Dr. Bradley Kessler over 4 years. 11 closed within 79 hours on average, with no witness interviews conducted. 3 removed entirely from the standard compliance system and refiled under executive-level credentials, each removal falling within days of a capital campaign milestone tied directly to the same surgeon's name. Appendix D contains something else, a full accounting, department by department, of every complaint filed at St. Adeline in the past 4 years, cross-referenced against outcome and closure time. The pattern Kessler represented wasn't isolated to him. It was simply the version loud enough, finally, for someone standing close enough to see it happen with her own eyes. Camille reviewed the final draft alone in her office the night before submission, the same worn notebook from the hallway sitting closed on the corner of her desk. She thought about Imani Duval's steady hands laying 2 complaint responses on a conference table, 4 identical words printed on each one. She thought about a first-year resident admitting, in a shaking voice, that he'd watched something happen that same morning and something similar before it, more than once. She thought about Bradley Kessler's face in that hallway, the exact moment his certainty ran out of road. None of that belonged in a formal state document. But it was the reason the document existed at all, and Camille understood that distinction better than most people ever would. She signed the final page, sealed the report, and sent it forward. The consequences, when they came, would not arrive all at once. They rarely did. They would come in waves, each one landing exactly as hard as the specific failure it was built to answer for, no harder, no softer. The first wave was aimed at Bradley Kessler. It arrived 12 days later. The notice arrived on Bradley Kessler's desk at 7 o'clock in the morning, hand-delivered by the hospital's chief of staff, who didn't sit down for the conversation. Formal reprimand. Mandatory professional conduct remediation, 18 months minimum. Removal from all supervisory teaching responsibilities, effective immediately. His name withdrawn from the cardiac wing capital campaign materials, pending final review of associated donor agreements. He was not fired. Camille had been explicit about that distinction in her report, the same way she'd been explicit about it to his face in the conference room. Individual punishment without systemic reform addresses the symptom, not the disease. His behavior, egregious as it was, had been rewarded by an environment that punished almost nothing. The consequences reflected the incidents themselves, severe, but calibrated. Not a career-ending gesture. A recalibration nobody in that hospital had ever forced him to make on his own. It still cost him plenty. The remediation program required weekly sessions he couldn't skip, couldn't charm his way out of, couldn't reschedule around a surgery he'd decided mattered more. His name came off 2 donor plaques already engraved, the metal quietly reordered at the hospital's expense. Residents who'd once competed for a spot on his service now requested reassignment, careful and polite about it, never quite explaining why. He called his father that evening, a retired cardiologist who'd built his own reputation the same way Kessler had built his, loud, certain, rarely questioned. The call lasted 4 minutes. His father, for the first time Kessler could remember, didn't have much to say. Kessler sat afterward in the same surgeon's lounge where he'd hidden for 2 hours the day this all started, staring at a cup of coffee he wasn't going to drink. He kept returning to the same 2 words, the ones that had landed harder than anything anyone had said to him in his entire career. Are you done? Not angry. Not frightened. A simple question from a woman who'd absorbed every insult he'd thrown at her and catalogued it like a scientist recording behavior under glass. He hadn't been a respected surgeon in that hallway. He'd been a specimen. His phone buzzed. A message from the department administrator, remediation orientation, Thursday 8 a.m. attendance mandatory. He set the phone down without responding, and for the first time in a long professional life built entirely on being the loudest person in every room he entered, Bradley Kessler sat in complete silence and let himself actually think about what he'd built that reputation on top of. It didn't feel like much, once he finally looked at it directly. Jae-won Shin was formally removed as CEO on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the report landed. The board's official language read loss of confidence in executive judgment, 6 words that meant, in practice, 1 word, finished. The finding rested on specifics, not impressions. First, deliberate removal of 3 formal complaints from the hospital's compliance tracking system. Second, timing of those removals matched precisely against capital campaign milestones tied to the accused surgeon's public reputation. Third, no evidence Shin had ever referred any of the 3 complaints to legal or regulatory review, despite clear obligation to do so. It was the third finding that ended things completely. Concealment wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a decision, made deliberately, 3 separate times, each one time to protect $11 million rather than the people the system existed to protect. Shin submitted his resignation within 72 hours of the board's vote. No farewell reception. No plaque of his own added to any wall. He cleared his office on a quiet Thursday afternoon, and the security guard at the front gate, who'd waved his car through without a glance for 4 years, did the same thing one final time, entirely unaware anything had changed. The third wave moved slower, and reached further than either of the first 2. Acting on Camille's formal recommendations, the State Health Department mandated an independent patient and staff safety office at St. Adeline, reporting directly to regional health authorities rather than hospital leadership. Complaint acknowledgement within 48 hours. Investigation opened within 14 days. Resolution within 60. Every complaint and its outcome entered into a centralized log accessible to state oversight, a system no future administrator could quietly move complaints out of, the way Shin had. A mandatory climate survey would run every 6 months, results delivered to the state office before hospital leadership ever saw them. The narrative could no longer be shaped before regulators had a chance to read it plainly. 9 other staff members received formal counseling documentation for failing to report or intervene during witnessed incidents. 2 department heads were reassigned. The compliance director who'd rubber-stamped 14 dismissals in 4 years was placed under separate review. None of it fixed St. Adeline overnight. Culture never moves that fast, no matter how thick the report or how many tiers its findings carry. But the architecture changed, the specific, structural kind of change that's difficult to quietly undo 6 months later once everyone stopped paying attention. And somewhere in an enlisted adjacent locker room 3 floors below where Jae-won Shin's office used to be, Imani Duval received a letter with her name on it, signed by hand at the bottom in ink instead of print. The letter stated that both of Imani's previously dismissed complaints had been reopened, reviewed, and substantiated. The senior attending from her first complaint received a formal reprimand. Kessler's remediation file was updated to include the incident from her second. At the bottom, beneath the typed language, was a line that hadn't come from any template. Ms. Duval, you kept copies when the system wouldn't. You spoke when an entire hallway stayed silent. The courage you showed that day is not a footnote in this report. It is the reason this report exists. Imani read it 3 times, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the same manila folder that had spent 14 months hidden beneath a stack of training manuals. This time, she set the folder on top of her desk instead of underneath anything. 6 months later, Camille Yates returned to St. Adeline Regional Medical Center. She didn't arrive in a cardigan this time. She wore her formal department attire, the same worn notebook tucked under one arm, the same one from that first hallway. The new interim CEO, a veteran healthcare administrator named Rita brought in from outside the system, met her at the entrance. Dr. Yates. Welcome back. How's the climate? Better, Rita said, without softening it. Not fixed. Trust takes time, Camille said. Accountability takes longer. They walked the surgical wing together. Camille noticed small things, a young nursing assistant walking down the center of a corridor instead of pressed against its wall. A mixed group of residents and support staff sharing a table in the break room without the old, unspoken segregation by title. A hotline number posted near the elevator bank in letters large enough to read from 20 feet away. Small things. But culture is built from small things, the same way it collapses from small things ignored long enough. Near the end of her visit, Camille paused in the doorway of the surgical corridor where it had all started, looking at the exact stretch of marble where an instrument tray had once scattered across the floor. "You okay?" Owen asked, beside her. "I'm fine," Camille said. "Just thinking about a 26-year-old who kept a folder under her training manuals for 14 months, waiting for someone worth handing it to." She looked at him. "I didn't fix this hospital. I just happened to be the one standing close enough, on the right morning, to finally see it." They walked out into the afternoon light. Camille's sedan waited at the curb. She set the notebook on the passenger seat, the same way she always did, and the car pulled away from St. Adeline for the last time. Somewhere behind her, in an office 3 floors up now occupied by someone new, a folder sat on top of a desk instead of hidden beneath one, kept, this time, not because the system demanded it, but because some things are worth remembering exactly how heavy they used to be. If you think respect should be given by rank instead of earned by character, think again, and stay a little more still the next time you're tempted to decide who deserves your attention. Like, share, and subscribe, because the next story is already waiting, and you won't see this one coming either.